Hello and welcome. These are some staggering numbers. The wealth of 10 richest billionaires in India would be enough to fund for school and higher education of Indian children for more than 25 years. 1% of tax on the wealth of 98 billionaires in India can fund the total annual expenditure of the Department of School Education and Literacy under the Ministry of Education. India's 142 billionaires now own more wealth, that's $719 billion, than 555 million people, almost half a billion people, which is really the bottom of the population. The richest 98 billionaires, I repeat, have the same wealth as the poorest 555 million people. And the Indian billionaires have seen their combined fortunes more than double during the pandemic, and that number has shot up by almost 40%. These and many other such figures are part of Oxfam's report on the annual report on inequality, which they've released, usually timed with Davos, which, as you know, now is virtual once again. But to understand this report, I'm now joined by Amitabh Behar, CEO of Oxfam in India. Amitabh, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, Govind, for inviting me. And
right.
just to say that I'm not the author. It's a full team that works on it. I work with the teams.
Absolutely. Yes, I meant author as Oxfam. So, okay. Yeah. So Amitabh, the report. This is a report that comes out every year, along with Davos, and Davos for another year is virtual. So presumably the opportunity to present it in physically has gone. But nevertheless, tell us what's changed in the last 2 years and why this change is more significant than ever before.
So, Govind, I would say that the trend has been visible for a while, but we're looking at inequality completely exploding. And you kind of gave those figures, but just look at the top 10 richest people globally. Their wealth has doubled during this period. And 99% of the global population actually has seen a decline in their wealth and income. And that's really the hard reality, that it's exploding. And look at the India numbers. You know, in India, you have, as you already said, that 102 billionaires we had last year. Now it's 142. On the other hand, there are several studies, and the most conservative estimates say that at least 4.2 crore people have slided into poverty in India. And there's some studies which are saying that it goes up to 15 to 16 crore people. The UN says that half of the new poor globally are coming from India. So what you're looking at is really inequality reaching obscene proportions. And what I would say, during this COVID year, to kind of respond to your question directly, there was this hope, at least, that with the pandemic, with the disruption that we saw in regular life, we would take some measures to address this growing inequality, which has enormous impact on people. But this is business as usual. And that's why I think it's so important that you are hit by a massive pandemic of the size that we saw. You have seen the impact on the poorest of the poor. We saw it starting with the migrant crisis, and we obviously saw it in the second wave. But at this moment, it seems as if governments across the world, including Government of India, feels that it's business as usual, and inequality is actually growing because of the economic and social choices we make. It's clearly a political choice that we have made. And just to say that I think that for an average person, it should be quite a simple one. If you give them a choice that, do you want the top billionaires to become richer, or you want more nurses, more hospital beds, more doctors in your hospitals? But we end up still choosing the first option.
Right. And how much of this wealth is linked to stock markets and stock market capital appreciation?
Sure. So it is a wealth that we are looking at. But even with that, what you're looking at, the surge is enormous. I think that's really what you need to look at. And there are now several studies coming. We saw the income inequality study also a couple of months ago, which is clearly showing that whether you're looking at income or wealth, inequalities are growing. And there's tremendous concentration of wealth happening at absolutely the top. So this is really an economy of the top 1% versus the 99%.
Right. Now, on a relative basis, these percentages have been there even before COVID or even before the pandemic. Now, is it possible that governments or policymakers have not had the chance to specifically respond to COVID because we are still in it?
So we are in it for the last now close to 2 years, and we could have responded, as in particularly, for instance, look at just last year's health budget. There's a decline of 10% in the health budget vis-a-vis the revised estimates of the last year. So we have not taken the opportunities that were there or that should have been taken, certainly around the health crisis that we saw. So I would actually say that there's much more that needs to be done. There are countries across the world. Argentina actually did introduce a one-time wealth tax, which has given them 2.5 billion USD to take, to respond to COVID. So there are countries which have started responding.
Right. So if we were to look at health specifically now, assuming you were to, let's say, put that 1% tax or an additional tax on the wealthy people or billionaires in this case, now, how would the transfer happen in a way that is meaningful and achieves the objectives that you are outlining? Because transfer in itself will result in transmission loss, or will see transmission loss, and a lot of it could be just one-off, and a lot of it may not necessarily go the way it usually does, since governments want to spend in many more areas if they get the hold of more money.
Sure, but Govind, that's a political choice that the government needs to make. We are clearly seeing that the health infrastructure in this country is starved of resources. For the last several decades, and this is not just about the last 4 or 5 years, we are looking at the health investment in the public health has hovered around 1.25. At best, it went up to 1.5, and that's where it is. There's successive governments, and I would even just remind us that even 5-year plans talked of at least 2 to 3% of investment. So I think it's very, very critical that we start looking at greater resource mobilization. That's the point that you're talking of by introducing a wealth tax, because we do need that redistribution. But on the other hand, also ensure that this money gets invested in the right sectors, particularly education, health, social security, which have been drivers of an equal society. So, the larger questions of governance, yes, there will be leakages, but that's a larger question. I think we need to start by at least acknowledging that we have poor health infrastructure. It's really starved of resources, and we do need a very intentional, very conscious investment of our energies, and I would say political prioritization of health.
Right. Could the wealthy, again, billionaires in this context, distribute some of their wealth themselves? And would there be a way to measure that? And because you have talked about measuring this problem, and we'll come to that as well.
Sure. So Govind, I would say that one of the critical reasons for a more unequal society is that the super rich are not paying their fair share of taxes. I think that's important. Last year, I was looking at the global tax network study, which says that almost $450 billion are evaded from taxes. So that's the level of evasion of taxes you see. We have seen in Pandora paper, even from the Indian super rich, how they have tried to avoid taxation. So, my first request would be that we need to ensure that the super rich pay their fair share of taxes. And then, yes, once they've paid their fair share of taxes, one could look at some amount of philanthropy that they could do. But it is critical that the fair amount of fair share of taxes is paid. And it is the government, it's the public health system,
right,
which is able to respond to the enormous crisis that we are facing.
Right. So, assuming, let's say, wealth tax was not on the table, and it is a tough proposition, admittedly, not just in India, but all over the world in different ways, of course. What are the other ways that any government or this government can work to reduce that inequality that you've highlighted?
Sure. So there are multiple measures of doing it. Wealth tax is just one of the first steps, and we think that politically also the time for a wealth tax has come. And if you just look at what's happening globally, the social unrest that we've seen across several countries in the last couple of years, a lot of it is related to inequality. And I think it would be important for us as a society to wake up to the discontent with inequality and start addressing it. However, still to take your question, even within the existing resources, it is a question of reprioritization. So, we've looked at how we have reduced the corporate tax in the last year. We could really relook at bringing it back. So there can be several other measures. There's also about reprioritizing. So we
right.
are
Direct tax
at,
contributions have been going down, particularly from corporate tax. Indirect tax, which hits everyone, has been going up, I think, as your report has pointed out.
So that's another issue that, we are looking at the indirect taxes actually going up, which again hits the poor. So in essence, what we're looking at is reimagining the entire economic system and certainly taxation, which would be critical, that ultimately, if the telos of the society, the objective of the society is to create a more equal society, we'll have to take measures. We cannot continue as business as usual while you're seeing this explosion of inequality. So these are hard, maybe political choices, which might appear hard political choices, but I do think that these are absolutely critical for the well-being of the society, for ultimately the constitutional vision of an equal society is completely eluding us if we are not even taking those measures. Right. And Govind, if I just add one more point, just to emphasize my point, that we are talking of taking the 1.5%, 1.25% of the GDP investment in health to 3%. And let me still say that we were still much lower than even our other several South Asian or BRICS peers. So it's not that we are making a huge jump ahead of many others. So that's also important to underscore.
Right. So let's focus on gender for a moment. Let me pick up another data point from your report. Women accounted for 28% of all job losses and lost 2/3 of their income during the pandemic. This had a direct impact on their access, for example, on sanitary products. And similarly, you've talked about if there were more taxation, then that could be redistributed. But again, let's take the taxation off the table for now. How do we, from your perspective, address this immediate challenge of gender disparity, which has been accentuated by the pandemic?
Sure. So, again, there are enough studies which are telling us of how women are getting pushed out of the workforce, certainly from the formal sector. In the last few years, we have very categorically, in fact, 2 years ago, our report actually focused on the care economy. And that's something that we certainly must focus on. So, if I remember correctly, that women do 12.5 billion hours of unpaid care work every day. That's what the staggering figure that we had found 2 years ago in our inequality report. I think, this is like one of the first things that the government needs to recognize the unpaid care work of women. It needs to invest much more sincerely and seriously in the care economy. Uruguay actually has gotten a law for care economy. And then we certainly need to look at also gender parity in terms of wages. And we are seeing that gap, because another data that we have, that just because of the hit of COVID, the gender parity that we could have reached in 99 years has now pushed to 135 years. So there are again very, very concrete measures of just investing in the care economy, looking at different kinds of from the Anganwadis to patient care. These are things that they need to look at.
Right. Okay. So in the way forward, there are 5 points that you've outlined. So the taxation and the revenue part we've touched upon already. But one important point is recognizing inequality is real and measuring it. Tell us about how you would measure it, and how could we go about it in a way that is feasible and also ensures that we can see quick results.
Yeah, sure. So we are talking about recognizing and measuring it, which has not been done so far. But let me just say that post the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly where we have goal number 10, Niti Aayog has made a beginning in terms of trying to look at inequality, but it's still fairly inadequate. And we certainly need to start looking at income inequality. We are even suggesting at least 2 rounds of surveys across the decade to be able to measure both income and wealth inequality. And I think that would be critical. It will go a long way in helping us understand how inequality is moving, how's it growing, and therefore then we can probably start looking at specific policies to address it. As they say that if you don't measure it, you don't work on it. So I think it's very critical. But the good news, I think, with Niti Aayog starting to do it, is that it is coming into the conversation.
Right. The other point that you've talked about is statutory social security provisions for informal sector workers. Now, there are some interventions, including Ayushman Bharat, which again, the insurance scheme, which is a massive scheme, and that in some ways addresses one part of a typical informal workers challenge, which could be health. What else could we be doing or should we be doing?
Govind, I just wanted to say, because you talked of Ayushman Bharat, we have that one data also, which I think is fairly stark, that just 1% wealth tax on the 98 richest families can actually fund 7 years of Ayushman Bharat in this country. And let me just remind that this is probably the most ambitious insurance health scheme in the world. So that's the level of inequality we're looking at. But coming back to the social security for the unorganized sector, again, I think it's critical that we recognize the unorganized sector, start looking at providing the social security, which starts with the basic infrastructure from creches to Anganwadis to daycare centers to old age homes on the one hand. On the other hand, I think it's also very, very critical to start looking at formalization of their contracts, ensuring pensions. So it's a whole range of actions that would be needed.
But some of this or a lot of this is already happening, if not at the central level, at the state level, right? Different states are working on various aspects of it, whether it's Anganwadis, or if you were to look at a industry like construction. There are rules in place to ensure that there is social security for, let's say, construction workers.
Sure. So there's probably a recognition at the level of lip service, but that certainly is not the reality. And Govind, we saw what happened during the pandemic.
Sure.
It's just one year ago, as in maybe 1.5 years ago, we saw how the informal sector workers had to actually leave those cities, which pretty much they built. The city runs because of them, but they had to leave those cities. They did not have any kind of social security. They did not have housing, and they had to leave those places. So there's several studies which tell us that the informal sector worker do not have access to either social security, security of tenure. In many places, they do not get minimum wages. They certainly do not have pensions and other benefits. So it is a long haul.
Right.
And that's something that we certainly need to work on.
Right. Last question, Amitabh. So what does an equal society look like to you?
An equal society is I think, the dream that we've seen in our constitution. And an equal society is where everybody has a fair wage. They get a living wage. I would really say that at least in an equal society, people must have the minimum floor of dignity. Every individual must be able to live life with dignity. I think that's the most critical thing, and we're not reaching there. And this inequality that we're creating is actually fueling the lack of dignity for many others. So there is a contradiction that we need to address and understand. It is not about, sometimes I feel that a lot of people still I get surprised, still talk about how you can create more wealth and let it trickle down. And that's not happened. So I would say an equal society is let's ensure the basic human dignity for every individual.
Right, right. Amitabh Behar, thank you so much for joining me, and look forward to speaking to you again as always.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Govind.